The year was 1940. Europe was burning. The skies over France and Belgium were thick with smoke and chaos, the sound of engines and gunfire echoing like thunder over shattered towns. Nazi tanks, the dreaded Panzers, rolled across the continent with unstoppable force. Their black crosses glared through the dust, and their steel tracks crushed everything beneath them: soldiers, hopes, and nations. Britain, standing alone across the Channel, watched the horror unfold. Its army had been thrown back to the sea, retreating toward Dunkirk. Thousands of men, wet and broken, returned home, safe, but humiliated. They had survived, but they knew one truth that haunted them all: the British soldier had no answer to the tank. The Panzer was king of the battlefield. And if Britain was to fight again, that had to change. In London, inside dimly lit offices filled with smoke and typewriters, military minds and engineers gathered. The War Office needed something, anything, that could give the ordinary infantryman a chance. They looked at the weapons they had. The boys' anti-tank rifle was already obsolete. Heavy, long, and nearly useless against modern German armor. Soldiers called it the elephant gun, but it might as well have been a toy. The enemy's new tanks laughed at its bullets. What Britain needed was not another rifle, but something revolutionary. In the backrooms of British design labs, ideas began to take shape. The concept was strange, almost mad. A gun that didn't fire bullets, but bombs. A weapon so simple that any soldier could use it, yet powerful enough to destroy a tank. A man named Major Millis Jeffers, a quiet but brilliant engineer, took on the challenge. He was known for his unconventional ideas. He believed in innovation born from desperation. Jeffers and his team worked in secrecy, experimenting with springs, tubes, and explosives. What they built looked nothing like a gun. It was ugly, a clunky, brutal device with a spring-loaded rod and a strange bomb on the end. They called it the PIAT, the Projector, Infantry, Anti-Tank. The PIAT did not rely on rockets or bullets. It used a huge spring to fire a shaped charge bomb. When it hit armor, the bomb's special design focused the explosion into a narrow jet of molten metal that could melt through steel. It was the miracle of science meeting the madness of war. Yet, when soldiers first saw it, they laughed. It looked more like a piece of plumbing than a weapon. Heavy, awkward, and nearly impossible to cock, it required raw strength to operate. The first time a soldier tried to arm it, he had to lie flat on his back, put his boots on the weapon, and pull the handle with all his might. Sometimes it fired accidentally, launching the round into the air. Other times, it simply refused to work. But when it did, it was devastating. In training grounds across Britain, soldiers were introduced to the PIAT. They cursed it, they bruised their shoulders, they strained their muscles, but they also began to understand its power. Instructors told them, if you hit, you live. If you miss, you die. It was that simple. The PIAT had an effective range of barely 100 yards, often less, but at close range, it could pierce any German tank. It wasn't a weapon for comfort, it was a weapon for courage. By late 1942, the PIAT was ready for war. Its first real test came in the deserts of North Africa. The British 8th Army faced the might of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The sun burned down on endless sand, and German tanks prowled the dunes like predators. Infantrymen waited in silence, hidden behind rocks and dunes, clutching their PIATs. When the enemy drew near, they aimed carefully, their hands shaking. One shot, one chance. A private fire. The projectile whooshed through the air, struck a Panzer's side, and exploded in a flash of orange fire. The tank stopped. Then it burned. The men cheered. The PIAT had drawn first blood. Word spread quickly. The weapon worked. Slowly, respect replaced ridicule. The PIAT was far from perfect. It was clumsy, it was heavy, and if you didn't brace it right, it could knock you unconscious. But soldiers began to trust it. They carried it into Sicily, then Italy, and then, in 1944, into the most important operation of the war, D-Day. When the British 6th Airborne Division dropped into Normandy on that dark night of June 6, many carried PIATs on their backs. They landed in chaos, scattered, alone, lost among fields and hedgerows. But when German tanks began to roll toward Pegasus Bridge, the PIAT spoke. One paratrooper, Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, is said to have fired one of the first shots of D-Day, a PIAT bomb that disabled a German armored car near the bridge. In those tense hours, every PIAT mattered. Soldiers crouched in ditches, waiting for the rumble of engines. When they heard it, they rose, aimed, and fired from impossible distances. The weapon kicked like a mule, the recoil shaking their bones, but the explosion that followed gave them hope. It was in Normandy that the PIAT became more than a weapon, it became a symbol of defiance. In towns like Caen, in villages surrounded by hedgerows and walls, British troops faced tanks at point-blank range. Some fired from barns, others from upstairs windows. One sergeant recalled firing his PIAT through a hole in a wall, destroying a Panther tank barely 30 meters away. He said later, "It was either him or me." But perhaps the greatest legend of the PIAT was born not in France, but in Holland, during Operation Market Garden, the bold and tragic attempt to capture bridges across the Rhine. There, in the shattered city of Arnhem, a man named Major Robert Kane made history. His unit was surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and pounded by German tanks. Kane had a PIAT, and his determination. Under constant fire, Kane held his ground. When a Tiger tank appeared at the end of the street, its gun glowing hot, Kane didn't run. He took aim, fired, and hit. The tank burst into flames. The recoil shattered his shoulder, but he refused to retreat. Later, when another tank approached, he grabbed another PIAT, reloaded, and fired again. When his weapon jammed, he fixed it in the middle of the battle. When shells exploded around him, he smiled and said, "I'm all right." His men later said he fought like a man who no longer feared death. For his courage, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor a British soldier could earn. Kane's story spread like wildfire. To many soldiers, the PIAT became a symbol of that same fearless stubbornness, ugly, heavy, unreliable, yet deadly in the right hands. It was a perfect reflection of the British fighting spirit, practical, gritty, and endlessly determined. The Germans learned to fear it. Tank commanders began to avoid narrow streets and hedgerows where British infantry might be hiding. A weapon that had once been mocked was now respected, even by the enemy. One captured German officer later admitted that his men called the PIAT, the little mortar that kills tanks. The weapon also found surprising uses. It could launch not just anti-tank bombs, but high-explosive rounds, used to destroy bunkers or enemy positions. In Italy, soldiers used it to take out machine gun nests hidden in buildings. In Normandy, some even used it to fire over walls, like a catapult of modern war. It was versatile, crude, and dangerous, but it worked. By 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany, the PIAT had become a standard companion to every British infantry section. It had seen them through the darkest years, from the deserts of Africa to the fields of France, from Sicily's ruins to Holland's canals. It had given ordinary soldiers a way to fight back against the steel monsters that had once ruled the battlefield. But after the war ended, the world moved on. New weapons replaced the old. The Americans had their bazooka, sleek, simple, rocket-powered. The British, too, began developing newer, safer systems. The PIAT was quietly retired, its metal parts stored, melted, or forgotten. Yet, among those who had used it, it was never forgotten. Veterans would gather in pubs or reunions and talk about the old days. Someone would always mention the PIAT, usually with a grin or a groan. One would say, "Do you remember how hard it was to cock that bloody thing?" Another would laugh and reply, "Aye, but it stopped a tiger." And then silence would fall, the kind of silence that holds both pride and pain. Because for those men, the PIAT wasn't just a weapon. It was a lifeline. Today, if you walk into the Imperial War Museum or any small regimental museum in Britain, you might see a PIAT sitting quietly behind glass. Its paint faded, its metal rusting slightly, its strange shape confusing to anyone who doesn't know its story. Children walk past it without a glance. But for those who remember, that piece of metal holds the memory of countless battles and countless lives. It represents a moment in history when Britain's back was against the wall and ingenuity met necessity. The PIAT was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be enough. Enough to give a soldier hope. Enough to make him believe he could fight back. Enough to prove that courage and creativity could turn the tide of war. In the final years of the conflict, the British Army destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks using PIATs. Its technology, the shaped charge, became the foundation for all modern anti-tank weapons. From the LOL rockets of Vietnam to the javelins of today, every one of them carries a piece of the PIAT's legacy. It was the first of its kind, a strange invention born in desperation, that changed the balance between man and machine. It's easy to forget that behind every weapon, there are hands, trembling, determined, human hands. Behind every shot, there is a heartbeat. And behind every explosion, there is a story of fear, courage, and survival. The PIAT story is not just about a weapon. It's about the men who carried it through mud and terror, who faced steel giants with nothing but faith and a trigger. In every battlefield photo of a British soldier crouching in ruins, holding a metal tube, you can almost feel it, the tension, the silence before the shot, the decision that could end a tank or end a life. That moment, frozen forever in history, reminds us that war is not just about power, it's about will. The PIAT may look crude to modern eyes, but in those desperate years, it gave the British infantry something priceless, a fighting chance. It turned fear into defiance, weakness into strength, and desperation into determination. So when you hear the word PIAT, don't just think of a strange, heavy weapon. Think of the men who used it, the engineers who built it, the soldiers who fired it, and the nation that refused to surrender. Think of Major Robert Kane standing wounded but unbroken in the streets of Arnhem, firing again and again until the tanks stopped coming. Think of the paratroopers in Normandy, lying in the grass, waiting for the rumble of steel. Think of all those who carried the PIAT not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Because that's what war does. It tests not just weapons, but souls. And the PIAT, in all its awkward brilliance, proved that even the most ordinary man could stand up to a tank and win. It was not elegant. It was not easy, but it worked. And sometimes, in war, that's all that matters. This was the PIAT, the weapon that stopped the Panzers. The invention that gave the British soldier the power to fight back. The weapon that turned fear into fire, and desperation into victory. And though time may rust its metal and fade its paint, the spirit it carried, the unbreakable spirit of the British soldier, will never fade.